My presentation is entitled The Insurrection, Resurrection, and the Afterlives of the Babaylon, Stories of Struggle of LGBTQI Persons in the Philippines. I recognize that the words I used here seem to amplify my distance from all of you. I also recognize the intentionality and the effort that is being put into this gathering. In a world where connections are still a challenge, not because we don't want to connect, but because there are powers, principalities, and systems that make it difficult for us to do so, I am grateful for all of you. And I wish to honor the spirit that animates this gathering. I kind of know that what I have to say is a contribution of some kind. And so I hope that what I have to say here today can help you in your work and your collective projects toward liberation and the common good. My name is Kakay Pamaran. EA to the President is just one of my jobs. I am also an understudy in the Biblical Studies Department. I'm doing New Testament writings, and I bring greetings from Union Theological Seminary, Philippines, on this year, 2021, marking the 500th year of Roman Catholic Christianization of the majority of 7,000 plus islands in our archipelago. On March 16, 1521, the Christian God arrived on our shores aboard the galleon ships sent out by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of what was then the Spanish Empire. This expedition was led by Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese explorer. So as Europe is remembering 500 years of the Reformation, we here in the Philippines are remembering 500 years of the Spanish conquest. Imperial Spain kept us as a colony for 333 years until they sold us to the United States of America in 1898 for $20 million. We were packaged with Cuba, Guam, and Puerto Rico like it was payday sale. And I say Imperial Spain to differentiate that Spain from the Spain we know now. Let me first explain to you what a Babaylon is. Before the galleons arrived on our shores, our pre-colonial societies, to varying degrees, recognized the leadership of these three individuals, or council of individuals: the Datu, or the village chieftain; the Panday, or the village blacksmith or craftsman; and the Babaylan, the village spiritual leader or priestess. She's also the midwife, the village midwife, and the village healer. I invoke the Babaylan in this presentation because their executions, as recorded, were pivotal to the success of the imperial project of Christianization of our archipelago. The surest way for the colonizers to control the tribes was to kill off their spiritualities and beliefs, and with it, the memory of the culture. Lenny Strobel describes in her writings how the Babaylan, especially those who took up arms and fought back, were skewered and left to die slow deaths along the riverbanks to be eaten by crocodiles. The crocodiles in the jungles of Mindanao are huge. We still occasionally hear of folks finding these giants by the rivers. One of the bigger ones they caught in the early 2000s was about 20 feet long. And so the reference of the Babaylan resurrecting from the crocodile's belly is a reference to these historical executions. And the Babaylans who escaped capture and execution were forced to hide and disappear deep into the forests. Then came the awful smear campaign about them. And so in the decades following these executions, all of the horror stories told to children are about the aswang, or a mythical creature that climbs up through thatched roofs and suck out embryos from their mother's umbilical cords. Or the manananggal, a beautiful enchantress that, during the full moon, hunts by splitting in half, and her upper torso growing wings that resemble that of the wings of fruit bats, flying over the forests and the fields looking for cattle or children to eat. Or the mangkukulam, or the mambabarang, a bruja, a witch that can cast all sorts of spells. These stories are still being told to this day. As a child, I would spend my summer vacations in my mother's town in an island in the Visayas called Siquijor. Our companions in my grandmother's household would tell these stories to me and my cousins, perhaps to stop us from playing outside after sunset. The demonization of the brave, strong, and wise Babaylon ensured the colonizers' control over our spiritual narratives. The Babaylon imagery was then replaced with a Christian version of women saints and martyrs who were venerated for their humility and tolerance to torture and oppression, and their total submission to the will of the Christian God. The other reason for invoking the Babaylon is to draw your attention to how it is spelled using one of the more common variations of ancient pre-colonial scripts, the Baybayin. Babaylon, Baybayin, I know they sound similar. And we have more sounds represented than just these syllabic combinations, ba or bay, that I've just introduced so far. Right now, we are seeing a re-emergence of the use of our pre-colonial scripts. This is particularly huge among younger people who physically live in the Philippines and those in diaspora. Because the intentional study of these scripts have been popularized, I can actually now talk to you about this with more confidence, even if I'm not a linguistics expert or an expert on ancient indigenous writings. Our scripts cannot be understood like we do with the English alphabet. I'll not really go into that, but ba is the first syllable, and it is written in the shape of something like a breast or buttocks or an inverted heart, although I do not think that they thought hearts were shaped like that back in the day, or a uterus. Babaylan is therefore spelled like this. Our word for woman is babae, and in my native tongue, it's babayi, and it is spelled like this. Our word for the divine maker, or the rough equivalent, the Christian God, is bathala, and it is spelled like this. The last letter la, by the way, is the first syllable of our word for man, lalaki. Our word for rainbow is bahaghari, which literally translates to the king's loincloth, and it is spelled like this. There is always a linguistic reference to the femininity of these words. The Babaylan is always a woman, according to Carolyn Brewer's research. If chosen to be Babaylan or Baylan, and if, for instance, the one who was chosen happened to be male, they will wear their hair long, will dress, speak, and will live as a woman. Divinity, as in most pre-colonial indigenous societies around the world, is almost exclusively a feminine space. And this is why our queer feminist theological articulations, at least in our training here in Union, begin with the Babaylan. And so I choose, as a means to tell our LGBTQI struggles from this side of the world through the myth, enfleshment, incarnation, insurrection, resurrection, and the afterlives of the Babaylan. If you Google us, you will see that our formal name is the Republic of the Philippines and that our official state religion is Christianity. We are the only Christian nation in Southeast Asia. We are also among the most corrupt countries in the world, one of the most dangerous places for media practitioners, one of the most deadly countries for farmers and laborers. Lately, our head of state, Rodrigo Duterte, has racked up debt that has surpassed the grand total of all the debts incurred by all the presidents before him. He said it was for COVID. But we are still way up there in the list of number of new COVID infections per day. Barely 20% of our country is vaccinated, and there is no end in sight. This poor COVID response has eclipsed his record of the number of drug-related killings that that has numbered to 20,000 deaths plus since he came to power. And these deaths are mostly from urban poor communities. There is a culture of impunity and murderous rampage in our country. Activists, lawyers, leaders, organizers of peasant, farmer, and urban poor organizations assassinated. The passage of the anti-terror law of 2020 meant that arrests of voices of dissent and criticism against the state are legal. Our civic spaces are shrinking. And when church people exercise their prophetic duties to the people, they get persecuted and threatened, arrested or killed or disappeared. That's the job here. And we are going to try to see this through. In many ways, our religious consciousness here in the Philippines, and I do not speak only of the majority Roman Catholic pegged at 80% of our population, but the rest of the other organized religions and the new religious movements is still largely a narrow, heterosexist, patriarchal, colonial, and subservient to tyrannical rulers like Duterte. We have Bible-bashing folks citing Paul's letter to the Romans as their textual reference for supporting this murderous regime. This is the context of our ministry in general. We are basically in hell. So to be LGBTQI with agency, critical spirit in this context, well, you can just imagine. For starters, for instance, it is very hard to perceive progressive legislations here, like SOGI equality or the Human Rights Bill. All of those are still bills, and they have been for a decade, probably even more. Marriage equality is not even a thought yet. I even remember the House deliberations on the Reproductive Health Bill. We have congressmen reciting the Apostles' Creed in the session hall. Anyhow, they managed to pass a watered-down version of that law. But more to the point, and I am sure some of us in this room know this, there are only two places in the world where divorce is outlawed: the Vatican and the Republic of the Philippines. Curiously, however, the Philippines is recognized as one of the countries that is most open to LGBTQI persons. A 2013 Pew Research Center survey says that the Philippines is the second most LGBT-friendly country after Australia. Meanwhile, according to a report by the World Economic Forum in 2016, the Philippines is 7th out of a total of 144 countries with the lowest gender gap and the most equitable view of gender. However, despite these recognitions, the true state of the LGBT sector in this country remains obscure. In fact, one of the main obstacles to writing a comprehensive research on the state of the LGBT sector in the Philippines is the lack of data on which the experience of LGBT people can be based. Currently, there is no official record of, say, LGBT population or experience from the government, while data from non-government organizations are limited and specific to a few areas or groups. The simple absence of data on the total number only reflects the government's disregard for the state of the sector. In essence, the lack of data is one of the reasons for society's lack of awareness of the extent and severity of the problems facing the LGBT communities and the government's lack of adequate response to the needs of LGBT people. The situation of the LGBT is no different from the current situation of the basic sectors in the Philippines. In fact, even the indigenous peoples, the people with disability, are also lacking in data from the government. I can, of course, show you statistics and tell you horror stories about the LGBT situation and labor and health and culture, religion, society. But these things you can pretty much do on your own with our friend Google. So let me instead tell you two stories so I can come full circle with the title of this paper that I am trying desperately to commit to. When I was doing my MDiv here in Union, We visited the picket line of factory workers from a liquor company that went on strike. Me and my fellow students, about 10 of us, commuted to get there, which took about 3 hours from our seminary campus. We brought fresh vegetables and rice and the money we collected from the seminary community as gifts to the striking workers. When we got there, we were greeted by this wonderful person with a beautiful face that matched her beautiful energy, wearing a big bow ribbon on her head and wearing a shirt that read Feminista. She was so gracious, and she introduced herself as Claire, one of the leaders of the labor union of that factory. She was so pleasantly surprised to see us, even if we had called ahead to arrange the visit. We were all in our clergy collars and had pectoral crosses the size of our egos. You know, the clergy drag. We were required to wear that, especially in solidarity trips. It's supposed to ward off the police. But honestly, in my experience, that's not really true. Anyway, Claire received our gifts and asked us to log our names on her record book. We asked if we could stay with them in the picket line for a night or two, and that we were willing to help with the chores and the upkeep of the camp while we were there. She said yes and introduced us to the rest of the union members. They were camped outside of the factory gate along the highway. The union were fighting for just wages and better factory safety protocols. We sat there and listened to their stories the whole night. It was then that we found out that Claire is United Methodist. We had 2 or 3 United Methodists in our group, so they asked if they could be excused from doing the chores so they can continue talking to Claire. And so they talked and talked and talked, and Claire shared that she was a praise and worship leader in her local church in another province far away. She had to leave for work in that factory. And she said that she isn't sure how her church will receive her now that she is a woman. That night, as Claire was sharing her life story, we were schooled on labor rights and all these big words that she never actually used: intersectionality, intersectional struggle, enfleshment, incarnation, transgressive theologies. Of course, not in those words. Claire is a trans woman, labor union leader. She is gospel to us. She is Babaylon, resurrected. We kept in touch with her. The union managed to convince the factory to yield to their demands. They won their case. But because our laws are biased toward investors and big businesses and labor contracting is still legal, their victory was all but temporary. Claire soon quit the factory and became a full-time union organizer in that area. The last time I saw her was when she visited me in my seminary home in 2019, I think that was, for my birthday. Incidentally, the late Ted Jennings was also in my house that day. It's a story for another time. But Claire was my special guest because I missed her wedding. She formalized her relationship with her boyfriend and co-union leader under the red flag up the mountains, a region that I have yet to find the courage to visit. Also a story for another time, because I want to tell the story instead. Since, and this is now another story, since September of 2018, we have been doing public worship in a tract of farmland near our seminary. This is a collective farm of a group of organized farmers who have been fighting for the rights to till the land. It's a very complicated situation, and our seminary has always been working in partnership and solidarity with them for over 30 years now. Our solidarity work come in many forms. We help them clear areas to prepare for planting. We run errands for them since many of our students aren't actually farmers. We help them harvest. We help them sell their produce on sidewalks. We also accompany them in court hearings and in protests in front of government buildings. There were instances when the police made demands to see their leaders, and we were always there to witness these conversations. Sometimes it becomes violent, or sometimes not. But we've always been there, ready to help, ready to de-escalate matters when the police or military cross the line. There were almost no instances when we literally spoke about theological or evangelistic matters to these farmers. Of course, they knew we were pastors and seminarians from UTS, but our conversations were never religious or anything like that. They just knew that every time they called for help, we would show up. We were there. The ministry was accompaniment and full solidarity. One day, one of their leaders named Miriam talked to our students and said that the organization has decided to formally request that we, seminarians, conduct Sunday services in the area. So this student walked into my office. I was then the field education director and told me, "Ate, sabi ni Nanay Miriam, magpapanambahan daw tayo sa Lupang Ramos ngayong Sunday, tapos forever na daw ganon." In English, Ate Nanay Miriam said that we will conduct worship service on Sunday and that we will do it forever. And then she sat down and said, "What are we gonna do?" We were both confused. So there's a student organization in seminary called Kasimbayan, or Kapatirang Simbahan para sa Bayan. Kapatiran, from the root word kapatid, meaning sibling. Simbahan is church. Bayan is country. So that's the combination of the words for the name of that group. It will sound awkward if I translate the name as it is said in Tagalog. I was a member of this organization when I was a student, and this was the group that was most active in engaging with the farmers. Anyhow, this organization decided to formally take on the responsibility of conducting Sunday worship. This was not a formal field ed program as such, because honestly, I lost my footing and I couldn't figure it out. I mean, church planting was not really my strongest suit. So I called my dean and asked what I should do, and she just said, "Well, just do it. We'll figure it out as we go." And so we did. So we started the first formal worship service on the first Sunday of September of 2018. One of my colleagues here in seminary used her credit card to buy us a portable PA system. And we set up a rudimentary chapel in one of the bigger sheds that the farmers used for their meetings. The students started out performing traditional liturgies from their own liturgical traditions, mainly the United Methodist Church and the United Church of Christ in the Philippines. The students were very systematic. They consulted the farmers, who were mostly Roman Catholic. The students were also very sensitive about the fact that these farmers were not accustomed to seeing female priests. However, as expected, these organized farmers were very sure of their answers, that gender was not the problem, and that they want to spend more time on the stories of Jesus and the parables. So the students huddled and proposed a format. The lectionary reading was to be sent ahead of time on a Wednesday so that the farmers can gather in small groups to talk about the text. And then come Sunday, the homily was a hybrid, or it was a hybrid of a short reflection by a seminarian and then a sharing by the farmers. And I cannot even begin to tell you how precious the farmers' insights were. What they had to share in these services are among the sharpest theological reflections that I've ever heard from those who were not theologically trained, those who could not barely read. In one of our assessments, one of our students suggested that we give the lectionary reading for the next Sunday instead. You see, our students still had church assignments, and they report to their assigned churches in the morning and came to the church in the farm in the afternoons. The students wanted the farmers' insight to inform their Sunday sermons in the regular churches. In effect, the lectionary calendar of the farmers' church is one Sunday ahead of the revised common lectionary for the rest of us. That's not the end of my story, of course. One day, one of the leaders, Nanay Miriam, approached me and asked, in Tagalog, of course, "Pastor, can you please explain Saji to us?" I asked, "What?" She said, "Saji. You know about the bakla and the tomboy?" "Ah," I said, "you mean Soji?" And she said, yes, that's what I mean. You see, Pastor, some of our members, some of the youth here might be bakla, and we want to understand them better. And so I contacted the National Council of Churches in the Philippines and an organization called Bahaghari and coordinated our attendance to the 2019 Pride March. About 60 or so of the farmers arrived in 4 jeepneys. We went to a nearby church of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente and conducted Soji orientation, while the Bahaghari organization gave them a brief history of the Pride March in the Philippines and the Stonewall riots. The NCCP then talked about the church's prophetic response to injustices. And I can tell you, friends, with utter sureness and confidence, that Soji class I gave to the 60 or so farmers was the most received, the most well-received, one of the easiest Soji classes I ever taught in my entire life. These farmers, mostly middle-aged, most likely straight persons as well, understood struggle at its very core. They understood solidarity. They understood accompaniment. They understood persecution. So when we asked them if they were still willing to join the Pride March, they said yes. And they made placards about land reform and gender justice. It's a bit tad bit too militant for a Pride March, but hey, it was one of the best Pride Marches I've ever attended. And that day, I felt like the Babaylon had risen from out of the crocodile's belly. That was a good day. Our cultural memory would also tell of a gathering of the Babaylon when it was either a time just before a great harvest or a time when the village elders will decide whether they want to go to war, or a time when diplomatic negotiations needed divine intercession, or when it was a time to midwife someone into the world. Now, whether this memory is historically accurate or a product of our hopeful myth-makings and imaginative reconstruction of our past does not matter to me. Filipino scholars in diaspora and other scholars who immersed in our context wrote about this, and my Lumad friends have told stories about this. And my gut tells me that these are beautiful and true. And so I say it is worth repeating in this space. The Babaylan gathered in the time of war or of harvest or of birthing in a place such as this, in a time such as this. My friends, this is a prayer, an invitation, and a challenge for all of us here. If this is not a time before a great harvest, or a time when we decide to go to war, or a time when we have to intervene because diplomatic negotiations are at the brink of a breakdown, or a time of birthing, I ask that we all make it so. Amen.